Welcome to the Jewish Democratic Council of America's 13th community conversation on the crisis in Israel and Gaza, responding to campus anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th. My name is Jonathan Allen, and I'm a member of JDCA's New Leadership Council, a former outreach director at JDCA, and now the Assistant Director of Government Relations at ADL, where I lead our federal lobbying on education, including campus anti-Semitism. I'm proud to be opening today's conversation on an issue that's quite personal to me. When I was a Jewish student and the student body president at the University of Maryland, a campus with one of the largest Jewish student populations in the country, I experienced firsthand anti-Semitism on campus. Yet it is difficult to fathom what Jewish students on campus are facing in today's environment. Our recent ADL survey found that nearly 3/4 of Jewish college students experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism in the first semester of this school year alone, and less than half of Jewish students reported feeling physically safe on their campuses. I've witnessed attacks on Jewish communities, threats to Jewish lives and safety, and rhetoric treating Jews and Israelis as less than human. Each of these instances is sickening, but when I hear about the anti-Jewish and anti-Israeli hate on college campuses today, it is all the more heartbreaking. We go to college to learn, to expand our minds, and to consider alternative viewpoints. Parents pray for their children's safety and well-being and hope everything works out. But tragically, since Hamas's attack on October 7th, Jewish students have been victim to an unprecedented wave of anti-Semitic rhetoric and anti-Semitic episodes. We've seen videos of Jewish students needing to hide in libraries out of fear for their personal safety. We witnessed 3 university presidents dismiss concerns for Jewish safety, and we have read disappointing statement after statement as college after college responded to the October 7th attack, many of them not even mentioning Hamas nor the hostages. Today, we welcome 4 experts to our community conversation to help us make sense of campus anti-Semitism in the wake of October 7th and where we go from here. Moderating today's conversation is Stacy Burdett, an anti-Semitism expert who recently testified on the issue before the House Judiciary and Education Committees. She's a fellow member of JDCA's New Leadership Council. And our first speaker today is veteran journalist Nicholas Lemann. Nicholas is Dean Emeritus of the School of Journalism at Columbia University and the co-chair of Columbia's Task Force on Anti-Semitism. Tina Malka is the Director of Anti-Semitism Education and the Associate Director of the Israel Action Program at Hillel International. And prior to joining Hillel, Tina spent 15 years working at the ADL. Julia Jassey is the co-founder and CEO of Jewish on Campus, a youth-led organization responding to growing levels of anti-Semitism on college campuses around the world. Julia is a recent graduate of the University of Chicago in 2023 and holds a bachelor's in political science and Jewish studies. We look forward to hearing from all 3 of these panelists and learning from their on-the-ground experience and expertise. Thank you all for joining us, and Stacy, over to you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm going to start with Dr. Lemann, who I'm going to call Nick. You have been so thoughtful as a writer, as a journalist, and as a dean of the most prominent journalism school. You've been a forceful thinker about the broader trends that Jewish students are caught up in. And we are so seized with the moment-to-moment headlines and the incidents that we're all WhatsApping to each other and very concerned about. It would be really, really important for us to start the conversation with more of an understanding of the headwinds that we're up against. What are the challenges in the higher ed landscape, and what do we need to know about that landscape before we can even pose good solutions? So if you could just do some scene setting for us, it would be helpful.
I'd be happy to. Thanks, Stacy, and hi, everybody. I should say to start, I live in a university. I've been at Columbia for almost 21 years, and I love this university. So you're going to hear from me the thoughts of somebody who is working to get some change in universities, but doesn't think universities are a lost cause. and I think they're worth making better. So that's my starting assumption. A big research university like Columbia, where I live, is a very complicated institution. It's not like a big business company where there's a command and control system and the CEO of the company basically can give orders that are followed or supposed to be followed by everybody who works there. Universities are a little bit like the old fable of the blind man and the elephant. They have a lot of different stakeholders who are essential to their existence. Some of the stakeholders are on campus every day. A lot of them are not on campus every day. That includes parents, alumni, and members of Congress and all sorts of other people. If you ask each stakeholder group to write a one-page description of what the university basically is for and what its core values are, if you identify half a dozen stakeholder groups and hypothetically they produce half a dozen of these statements, the statements will have very little or no point of intersection. So that's the challenge of leading a university, is keeping together a pretty fragile, as we now see, coalition of people who don't see each other regularly and have different visions of what the institution they care so much about is for. So that's one piece of background I would say is essential. A second piece of background, at least for this moment, is that for years, but especially since Donald Trump was elected president, there's been a kind of rising, what it would call itself, social justice movement on campuses that, rose through Trump's election, the stresses of COVID, and the George Floyd moment and what came after that. That movement tends to be pretty, well, in that part of the university, if you say, I am a Zionist, it doesn't go over well. You have to really explain yourself. So it's seen as kind of fundamental that Israel and Zionism are antithetical to social justice as it's defined at a lot of universities. And that creates a lot of problems and a lot of tensions. Most people in this movement would say, I am a passionate anti-Zionist and I am not an anti-Semite. The two have absolutely nothing to do with each other. And it's very hard to explain this. If you could do a rough division, there's this phrase, living a Jewish life. Everybody who lives a Jewish life at my university understands, you don't have to explain what anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism have to do with each other. They get it instantly. People who don't lead a Jewish life, including many people who are themselves Jewish, will say, I don't get it. They're two completely separate topics. So I don't understand why so many Jewish students experience these hot-blooded condemnations of Israel and Zionism as anti-Semitic. One other thing I'd say to start is that because of what I just said, and I should also say that many of the stakeholders who aren't here also instantly understand that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not two separate subjects. When you take anti-Zionism and turn it up to 11, a lot of stuff starts happening, that much of which is creepy. And so that's some of what you've seen over these last months, is an upsurge in what is officially anti-Zionism. And once that happens, a lot of stuff that is more obviously anti-Semitic starts happening, at least around the edges. And you see this on social media, you see this in incidents happening on campus. and the experience a lot of Jewish students have. So I hope that's a good intro, Stacy.
It is, and I can't tell you the number of times when I'm working with an organization, whether it's a Jewish organization, or I'll just use JDCA as an example, organizations feel so pulled between the different poles of the different kinds of Jewish democratic donors or Hillel stakeholders that it's if only they knew what it was like to have that times 100, like a university president does, and then we would understand, really what we're up against in sort of demanding some of the changes.
Yeah, and some
So,
of us, by the way, have some of these conflicts within our own families, our own Jewish families, that get expressed around holiday dinner tables and stuff like that. So I don't know if that applies to anybody listening, but it definitely applies to me.
Me too, as well. So in the middle of this, just there's this massive conservative attack on higher education, and of course, politicians, especially GOP politicians, they just start chomping at the bit to just slash these billions and billions of dollars. And we just want to improve the climate for Jewish students. And so a lot of universities have set up task forces like the one you co-chair at Columbia. And even those task forces are making headlines, right? The co-chair isn't kosher enough. Some people are stepping down.
Yep.
But help us again with your sort of thoughtful way. Help us level set our expectations. What can these task forces do? What should we look for from them? What is success, and what kind of realistic changes do you think they can influence or catalyze in universities?
So we don't have a formal trade association, but I spend a lot of time talking to other task forces. So I have some sense of the field, if it is a field. I should say first that, Hashem willing, we are going to issue a big, long report on Monday. And I believe that'll be the first public document produced by any university anti-Semitism task force. And I'm very proud of it. So look out for that.
No pressure.
Yeah. And it basically deals with rules for protests and demonstrations. So I guess what I would say generally about these anti-Semitism task forces is almost all of them, I predict, will focus very heavily on campus life, trying to adjudicate the Middle East conflict is for, Secretary Blinken and President Biden, and not for the Columbia Anti-Semitism Task Force. The more we go there and make statements about Israel, Gaza, Zionism in general, the less good we'll do, because it just creates a big fight. So we're really trying to understand ourselves as having a mandate to improve the climate on our campus and the other task forces on their campus. Our job is, in particular, to notice and listen to the extreme discomfort and sense of rejection that a lot of Jewish students here feel, a very sad thing, and try to figure out ways to do something about it. So I want to set that as a frame. I think what you're going to see from a lot of task forces is a fairly similar set of things, which is first what I was just talking about, which is, clarifying the rules and calling for consistency in enforcement of the rules about public protests and demonstrations, where they can take place. The jargon for this is time, place, and manner restrictions, where they can take place, when they can take place, how they take place. A much more contentious area is, which I can talk about more if you want, is specific things being said at demonstrations. Second part of what these task forces will do is address kind of student life issues that aren't about demonstrations and protests. These would include orientation procedures on anti-Semitism for incoming students and incoming teachers on campuses, places to go with complaints, clarifications, and consistent applications of rules around harassment and discrimination, and understanding that university diversity, equity, and inclusion offices have anti-Semitism and other hates like Islamophobia and anti-Asian as part of their mandates, which most of them don't have now. So I think it's likely that all the anti-Semitism task forces will address that. The third and by far most touchy and contentious area is what happens in classrooms and academic schools and departments. And the reason it's contentious is there's a much stronger norm there that this is not the job of the university administration at all, and it's completely under faculty governance. So we're essentially a task force working for the administration as part of the administration, but the administration has very limited power over courses and appointments. So, that's all the anti-Semitism task force are going to look at those issues, and they're very challenging.
Yeah, I think the task forces are really important. I think those potential gains are really worth it. Something tells me Virginia Fox, who I remember called the murderer of Matthew Shepard a hoax as a pretense to pass hate crime laws. I don't think the biggest critics are going to be very satisfied and say, wow, these are some amazing orientation procedures. So I think that's going to be a challenge.
I agree with you. And
yeah.
by the way, just as a sort of editorial side comment, on our friends who are anti-Zionist here at Columbia tend to think all of this is the result of pushback from quote unquote rich Zionist donors. They don't know the half of it, because I think first of all, as has already been mentioned at the outset, the extreme discomfort of a lot of Jewish students and their parents and of Jewish alumni needs to be acknowledged. It's not just about donors, but in terms of threats to the university and people driving this, the politicians are way more important than the donors. Columbia gets a lot more money from the federal government than it does from rich Zionist donors, believe me. And, if the Republican Party has a good election year this year, if it finds this time next year that it controls the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court, which is not in any way out of the question, I think it's going to be kind of open season on universities with this issue in the store window, so to speak.
Absolutely. And I do worry, we always are taught, believe authoritarians when they tell you what they're going to do. And even if the whole Department of Education is not collapsed, which is an explicit plan, there's no question that the Department of Education Office of Civil Rights is under attack. The Republican vision is to throw those responsibilities back on the states. And I don't mean to terrify a parent or student, from Tulane who might be watching this program, but I would rather have Catherine Lemann at the Department of Education adjudicating my child's complaint than to throw it to the state of Louisiana and see what they're going to do. So the stakes of this onslaught by conservative politicians are very, very high for the students. So let me just ask you, so what do you say to alumni and friends who are cutting their donations again, they may not be the Ackmans. I hope you have very powerful, rich friends, but we hear from a lot of donors to their university who want to use their donations as leverage. What do you advise them to do?
Well, I'm not in the development office, fortunately, so I don't have to be on the receiving end of those calls right now. But what I would say is, first of all, at the level of day-to-day life, you know, and this is true in this role I'm playing too. I just hear the bad news, but it's not as bad as you would think if you just hear the bad news. And I'm not trying to minimize anything, but it is possible, and is the majority experience for Jewish students to have, a fine time at Columbia and not to be harassed. Having said that, harassment and discomfort is absolutely unacceptable. And I think, the university administration gets that, takes it seriously. That's why they appointed us. We're working on this really hard. And we're, as I said, about to issue the first of what will be a series of recommendations. And we issue them in confidence that, they'll be accepted and enacted, and that'll make things better.
Thank you. And you mentioned the difficulty for the task force, and I think we all feel it, of making judgments about things that are said. And I want to ask you, as an educator and as someone who's had, a lot of experience just on campus and with students, we know that the university is a place where uncomfortable things have to be said. Are we failing to prepare our children, our students to navigate that discomfort?
I think about that a lot, Stacy, I really do. And, my kids went to Jewish day school, and, it's an issue in the day school community, as I'm sure you know, because on the one hand, you don't want to tell a third grader, there's a whole lot of people out there who really hate the state of Israel, and you're going to meet them one day. On the other hand, a lot of my kids' classmates get to college and they just think, whoa, I had no idea that this, white hot anti-Zionism was a prevailing attitude on campuses, because nobody told me that. So I don't know where you come down on that, but I as a parent wrestled with that a lot. I want my children to love Israel. My kids I have two kids in college. They wear a Mogen David around their neck every day. Stuff happens. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Tina Malka from Hillel. Also somebody I've worked with for a very long time. And I actually remember, Tina, the last time we had one of our hours-long conversations about this issue, I remember you were talking about things you were seeing, this is way before October 7th, that were making students cry. And I remember asking you, do universities have a responsibility to make sure students don't have anything to cry about? So we were talking about this same issue. And I want to ask you, Tina, because you are one of bridge builders are in short supply, and you're one of the best bridge builders I've ever known. How are you managing Jewish students, whether in different groups or coalitions, where the Jewish students themselves have really different views on these issues, but they all need your support? How are you able to manage that? And welcome, and nice to see you.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Yeah, I mean, Hillel is a pluralistic organization. Our tagline is all kinds of Jewish, and we mean that very sincerely. We want to make sure that Jewish students from a variety of backgrounds who have different identities, different connections to Judaism, different connections to Israel, all have a place at Hillel. And so we want to provide a space that allows students to explore their Jewish identity, explore their connection to Israel, and to do that in a place where they feel safe and welcome. And we know that in recent polls, Jewish students are feeling very safe to come to Hillel and to be at Hillel. You know,
Yeah, go ahead.
no, I'm just saying, you know, we have a lot of different programs that engage students. We have a teach-in that is going across the country right now that brings a variety of speakers from Israel and the United States to enter into dialogue with students so they can have deep conversations within Hillel and explore different ideas and different thoughts and ask the questions that, you know, they might be nervous to ask in a larger group. And the Israel Summit I just got back from in Atlanta, where we had 800 students from over 200 universities gather together in Atlanta for a couple of days of intensive conversations with thought leaders across the country. And so we really at Hillel strive to make sure that Jewish students can really enter into dialogue and enter into conversations across all difference and across all conversations, because we want students to be able to feel comfortable with that in those conversations.
That's great. And how are you advising students to navigate? Let's just say we're in a period where, you know, maybe the anti-Semitism task forces have been updated. Some responses have been good, some have been slow. How are you helping students navigate just walking to class when there's a demonstration in front of the building, or extracurricular clubs where they feel uncomfortable or excluded? Like, what is your best advice to students who are just navigating this climate, which is very, very, I know just from my own work, it's such a distraction from learning and living and socializing. So what is your advice?
Yeah, I mean, our Hillel's most important thing is we want to make sure students feel secure and safe, first and foremost. And, you know, in our mind, all students at university should be able to live in a dorm comfortably, walk across campus and go to classes. All of those environments have been impacted by the anti-Semitism that we're seeing across the United States. We've recorded over 1,000 anti-Semitic incidents since October 7th. That is, between October 7th and January 7th, there was a 700% increase just in anti-Semitic incidents on college campuses. And so we want to make sure that students feel comfortable all across campus. We work with our CCI team, the Campus Climate Initiative, with administrators, to work with administrators also to engage in conversations. We encourage students obviously to report at reportcampushate.org and also on their anti-bias sites on their campuses when things happen. Because unless, you know, if a student feels unsafe, we want to make sure the university is aware of that. And when students say that they feel unsafe, we want to make sure that that is qualified and explained in detail so they understand exactly what they're dealing with. And so we're requiring, yeah. Go ahead.
No, that's great. And I think and the task forces are also probably going to be good partners for Hillel in this area,
Absolutely.
just sort of naming the problem. So when we first met like 100 years ago, working together at ADL, when we mapped campuses where there were these demonstrations and hotspots, they were all the same campuses that were sort of inflamed in the 60s. And I bet that is not the exact correlation now. I bet it's in some more places, but you've been watching this for a pretty long time. What do you see as the differences or similarities between campuses where there are big problems, like some of the Ivies or some of the schools that have been most in the headlines? And thankfully, my son is at one. There is a vast majority of campuses where just this conflict is not the most important thing happening every day. What do you think determines what puts some campuses in this hot zone and others where it's just a non-issue?
You know, I would love to say that there are campuses that are immune to this, but that's just simply not the case. Anti-Semitism is happening across the country on campuses, some to a lesser or greater degree. But the anti-Semitism that the Jewish community is experiencing is happening to all of us. It's a global experience with the global Jewish community. You know, we know that students feel, from our polling, we know that students feel safest when they're sitting inside Hillel. We know, for example, that, you know, two of the very positive things that have come out of this during this time is the incredible interest that Jewish students have in learning, all kinds of learning about Judaism, Torah study, learning about Israel, and also Jewish leadership, which is really demonstrated by the incredible enthusiasm we had at the Israel Summit, where again, we had 800 students, but we had a wait list of hundreds of students that weren't able to attend because Jewish students are experiencing this on so many different levels and so many different campuses. And again, I would love to say that there are places that are immune to this, but we haven't seen that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Tina. And you're right, I should say, I talked about campuses where the conflict is not the most important issue. And on those campuses, I will say, replacement theory is alive. Neo-Nazi ideology, white supremacy, white nationalism is alive. So it is true that even a non-hot zone has some very disturbing ideologies that are sort of also in the drinking water. So thank you so much, Tina. It's great to see you again. And I want to welcome to the screen the CEO of Jewish on Campus, Julia Jassey. And Julia, I would like to ask you, your organization is relatively new. You founded it in 2020. And, you know, new organizations have a lot of agility. And I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the assumptions and the strategies you started with in 2020 that you've been rethinking or changing, whether it's before October 7th or since October 7th? I'd love to hear about that, especially since it's a new organization.
Absolutely. And thank you all for having me. It's really great to be here, and to the incredible panelists before me, to hear your words was really insightful. So I appreciate that. Jewish on Campus was founded before October 7th. Initially, our goal was not to become a nonprofit. It was to create an Instagram page. And the reason for that was quite intuitive for us at the time, but strategic looking back. Social media, especially in a world since COVID, is a time and a place where students come together, where young people exchange ideas and information, and where we're exposed to experiences that we don't have personally. And there is great power in that, the power to change minds, the power to tell stories. And there is, of course, the reality that propaganda, anti-Semitism, and other forms of hatred are able to spread wildly, very quickly, in ways that really appeal to the generation of people who are living online and finding home there. And so for us, creating an Instagram page was very intuitive. We'd had experiences of anti-Semitism at our various schools. And for me, I come from Long Island, New York, as I'm sure half of this call does. And it was my first time ever really experiencing anti-Semitism, because it was my first time really being the only Jew in the room. And I remember my first experience was very specific. I was in a club meeting and someone told a joke. Someone from Germany actually told a joke saying that, you know, back home, they don't say that the Holocaust killed our families. They say that it was an extended vacation that they took to Germany and never came home. And at the time, I look back and that was very concrete anti-Semitism, but I was very scared to call it out. I was a brand new freshman on campus. I didn't want to be that kid. And now it's a very different time. Anti-Semitism still exists in these very clear, very pernicious ways, but it also masks itself in various forms of ideas that we would want to be a part of anyway. These spaces where we want to be a part of when it comes to gender equity, to racial equity, to climate justice. So many Jewish students want to be a part of those spaces and want to show up with their full Jewish identity celebrated. So for us, it's about a few things. It's meeting students where they are. It's using the tools and resources, although we've continued from there and we're no longer just Instagram. We are a nonprofit that's worked with, you know, every level, from university administrators, Department of Education, the White House, data science. We'll get into all of that stuff, but still staying true to the idea that social media is a place where that's where ideas are spreading. That's where young people are gravitating toward. And to speak in the language of the people that we're trying to reach is the best way to make an authentic impact for the community we're trying to educate.
Great, thank you. I'm glad you're not just an Instagram page. So you mentioned
Not anymore.
working you mentioned your work with the White House, and the White House, I sympathize. I'm sure Nick might sympathize with this as well, because the process of just trying to listen to all the voices out there, not as a university president with hundreds of communities like ours, but just in our community, was a really big project for the White House. And they really heard a lot of student voices, and the president came out with like the most impressive roadmap in the history of Western civilization to fight anti-Semitism. And understandably, a big chunk of the recommendations focus on campuses. I wanted to hear your take on what were the important recommendations in the strategy, and I'm sure you've picked some that you're following up on or hope to take across the finish line.
Absolutely. We were really honored to be a part of the process from the initial roundtable through lots of deliberation. We were really thankful to work with the White House. They were an incredible partner to the entire community in really listening to what we are saying as a Jewish community, but also a specific focus on students. It was really incredible that students were included in these conversations, that the young community who is impacted by these issues was also included in the conversations. And I think the most impactful approach that the White House took, that I'm really excited to see have a true impact, was the idea that this national strategy should be whole of government, but also should be whole of society. That there is an imperative that we all have. And I believe Dr. Lemann addressed the idea that there are different stakeholders, but also different capacities that each of us has to make a true impact. And that varies. You have the Department of Education, who should be opening more investigations, listening to students and adjudicating these experiences, as we found with the University of Vermont, which is a complaint that we filed back a couple of years ago. There is an imperative on Congress to fund them, to ensure that they have the capacity to increase the yield of submissions, because there's been a huge influx of submissions over the past, since October 7th. And to keep up with that demand, there's an imperative on university administrators to address anti-Semitism before it raises to the degree of a civil rights complaint, to ensure that they're doing the work and listening to the students who are most impacted by these problems. There's an imperative on university faculty to include anti-Semitism and Jewish voices in anti-bias trainings, to ensure that they're listening to the people who are experiencing these issues and bringing their experiences to make real change. And there's also an imperative on us, on the Jewish students, young Jewish people in the community, to use our voices, to use the seat that we've earned at the table, and to make sure that our experiences are listened to, that change can be made, and that we can be leaders, not just in the future, but today.
Thank you so much. And before we're going to turn to a couple of our former student fellows of JDCA, but I want to give you a chance to just say what is something you wish people. Everyone has pictures of Jewish students as victims cowering in their Hillel houses, and that pain is real, and it's affecting people who it never affected before. But what is something that isn't reported that you wish people knew about student life, or what Jewish students are up to in this moment?
Absolutely. And I feel like Tina, Malka, and I have discussed this in the past on previous panels. A huge thing is what it means to be, pardon the name, Jewish on campus. I think right now there is the focus on anti-Semitism because that's the biggest challenge that we're facing. Anti-Semitism is rising. That is a fact. The submissions and the yield of anti-Semitic incidences is higher rates than it has been in decades. And Jewish students are finding ways to meet the moment. And maybe for you, being Jewish on campus and an active voice is to be an advocate for your community, to be posting online, to be going and meeting with your members of Congress and being a champion for this cause. And maybe being Jewish on campus means just wearing your kippah and not letting that be something that you're intimidated away from doing. Maybe it means wearing a Magen David, or joining a Jewish sorority or fraternity, or going to Shabbat dinners at your Hillel, or services at your Chabad. Whatever that might mean for you is how you are Jewish on campus. And the celebration of that, I've seen so many more students since October 7th say, you know what, I'm going to be proudly Jewish. How that means to me, how I find pride and find excitement and find compassion and find a meaning in that identity. And maybe that means being the biggest advocate in the world and screaming about anti-Semitism until your lungs hurt and being someone who's the champion for that issue. And maybe that means just being Jewish and living on campus and not hiding your identity. And those are all valid expressions, and I think ones that should be celebrated.
Thank you so much, Julia. Keeping on the theme of student voices, I want to invite former JDCA fellows Sarah Gorstern and Jacob Schmeltz, who were JDCA fellows, and they worked on the ground with JDCA state chapters to mobilize students and to support JDCA priorities, and most important, top of mind right now, to get out the Jewish vote. So Sarah is a senior at Wash U. Jacob is a senior at Columbia. And I want to turn to Sarah to see if you want to pose a question to our panelists.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I definitely have a question, and I'm curious. So since October 7th, many Jewish students, including myself, have struggled to navigate personal relationships both with friends and classmates because of anti-Semitic rhetoric spread online or across campus. So how do you think that Jewish students can engage in this important yet divisive discourse in a way that doesn't alienate them from their peers? And when is it time to walk away?
Thank you, Sarah. I think a lot of people are having their friendships tested. Julia, do you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, I would love to. And Sarah, I think you're asking a question that all of us are struggling with right now. I think it's about finding environments where dialogue is possible and also prioritizing the comfort that you feel or don't feel in certain situations. These conversations are hard, but they have to happen. That's the way that our experiences are heard. That's the way that we can be challenged, and we can challenge others, and you can come to the table and agree. But if someone's attacking you, if someone is holding you to an anti-Semitic litmus test, if someone is ostracizing you because of your beliefs or making you feel uncomfortable, you don't owe them your energy or time. But conversations will be hard, and they will be something that you struggle with, and that doesn't mean that you should run away from them. And sometimes you can find them in new places. I was a part of a conversation at the US-UN a couple of weeks ago with Jewish and Palestinian young leaders coming together and having conversations. And that really gave me hope that we can have those experiences, but you shouldn't put yourself in an environment where you're being attacked, where you feel uncomfortable, where you feel like your identity is delegitimized. But you should find opportunities where there are friends who are people who you can trust, who you trust as well, and you can find ways to share your experiences and learn from theirs.
Thank you, Julia. Anyone else want to add anything to what Julia said?
Sure, I'd love to.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so ILN Students is the Israel Leadership Network, which is hundreds of students across the country that are involved. They all came to the Israel Summit this last weekend. We also had a program about a month ago called Content Creators, where we help students really navigate social media and learn how to make their posts effective and that people are engaged with them. But to Julia's point, our students sometimes feel that you have to respond to everything you hear. And the fact is, you don't. And I think it's really a point of strength to realize that just as she just said, no one deserves to have the right to make you more anxious or to affect your mental health in ways that really damage you or harm you. And again, our focus is making sure that Jewish students feel safe and secure. And that's included in making sure that they understand that their boundaries are their boundaries, and they should keep those boundaries and make sure that they only make choices that are the best for them and engage with people who can have meaningful conversations with them. And dialogue across differences is incredibly important, but it has to be civil dialogue. And that is something that we see that is greatly lacking in social media.
Thank you so much, Tina. And thank you, Sarah, for that question. Jacob, turning to you.
Yes, thank you, Stacy, and thank you to everyone at Jewish Dems for having me on today. So as a student at Columbia University, which is a campus that has struggled immensely with anti-Semitism in the past couple months, I've heard many conflicting visions of what a positive campus environment looks like. What do you see in campuses that have successfully promoted political discourse while protecting their students? What should universities be doing to fix the issues that have been discussed in today's program, and what can Jewish students do to help themselves?
Nick, that sounds like a good one for a dean.
Okay, well, I think, in terms of what the university should do, the most important thing is to take the stated principles of the university and the rules and bureaucracies that are on the books and apply them consistently across the board, and particularly to Jewish students who haven't been really included within the rules that apply to everybody else. So that's a meaningful step around some of the things I've talked about before: time, place, and manner restrictions, orientations, complaint procedures, what can and can't be said in a classroom, etc. So those are, if you will, the low-hanging fruit. The social media space is incredibly hard to police. I know Harvard has been in conversation with SideChat, which is the Slack equivalent that a lot of universities use, including Columbia, to try to get them to do more content moderation. Maybe that'll help, but it's that's kind of outside, for the most part, outside of the control of the university. For students, tell me if you agree. This doesn't seem like the right moment at Columbia to have conversations about Israel and Zionism with people who are basically anti-Israel and anti-Zionist. I think those conversations at this moment are best had at Hillel or just sort of within the community. We're not going to settle this by having a dialogue because the temperature is just too high and the perspectives are too different. So I think the thing to strive for, and this is how I try to live my own life in these difficult times, is, I have students, I have colleagues. These are people who are a big part of my life and I see every day. And we just don't go there. We conduct our life as a professional and friendly professional environment that isn't about trying to settle or come to agreement about what's going on in the Middle East right now. And so far, knock on wood, that's happening. My class is going just fine this semester, and I have a number of students who are active Palestinian cause people, but we just, our class is about being a journalist, not about who's right in this conflict.
Thank you so much, Nick. It is really important to understand just how do we get through this time? What do we do in the short term? And what's aspirational maybe for the fall semester or beyond. I wanted to just pose a final question to any of the panelists who wants to answer. Obviously, there are just outside organizations. People are just raising money on this issue like gangbusters. Politicians are campaigning on this issue. Do any of the three of you want to just volunteer a practical contribution that these outside organizations could make to support your efforts, whether it's on the side of faculty, on the side of administration, or students? Who wants to take a crack at that? It's a little bit bold.
I'm happy to go for it.
Great.
I think that students have so many ideas. The hardest part is to have the platform to share them. So many students want to speak to their administration, and it's really hard to get into the room where it happens because just being a student, hate to be pejorative, but we're treated that way. Young people are treated like in a pejorative manner, like we're just students, just young people. And I think that for trustees, for people who have influence in universities, they're able to get seats at the table that students aren't able to have. And that is an opportunity to bring students in. So whether those trustees are meeting with students or speaking to them or even bringing them to those conversations, I think that's an incredible way to hear their experiences, to hear what they think is happening in their classrooms with their peers, from their professors, and to actually make that change and having students being a part of the conversations where change is made.
Thank you, Julia. Anyone else?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly, so it depends on who you are. If you're a Jewish organization that isn't living at a university, I think, Jewish students who are in distress need a lot of TLC right now, and the primary place they're getting it is Hillel, which is great, but anybody else who has any way of helping to provide that, I think would be welcomed among students. Sometimes there's a tendency in Jewish organizations to say, we're going to do that by giving you talking points about the Middle East conflict, which is fine. But as I said before, I don't think that's the top of the pile for needs right now. I think needs right now is just, there's a place to be where people understand you and agree with you. And then for those who are in a position to give to universities, there's Jewish infrastructure that needs to be built up, and I think universities would welcome resources to build it up. Particularly Hillel's Jewish Studies departments, scholars of the Middle East who have a more balanced approach than some of the scholars who are around now. All of those things, I think, are ways to make life better, within universities. I should say, just as a little anecdote, I went to Harvard a long time ago. There was a social club that was called the Fly Club. It's still there, and they had a side yard, and they didn't admit Jews. And so every year on a particular day in the spring, you'd walk by and there was their garden party with all these impossibly blonde, beautiful people. You think, boy, do I ever not belong here? Well, that yard is now Harvard Hillel and makes me feel I do belong here. So it shows, things like that can make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Tina?
Yeah, one of the things that we want to always raise up is student voices. It is the campus that the students, it's their world, and it's the world that they exist in, and the one that they have to negotiate. And so whether we are preparing students to help supporting them to go in and speak to administrators or speak to trustees, every time there's a UC, I work in the West Coast, so every time there's a UC Regents meeting out in California, we gather students from across the system to come and speak to the UC Regents and talk to them about their lived experience with anti-Semitism, and make sure that the Regents understand what the students are living with and what the students need. And so I think the most important thing is making sure that Jewish students feel that they always have a place to get the experience so they can go in and have these conversations. And when they need help preparing for these conversations, we're always there to make sure that we're with them in the meetings, we're with them prepping for the meetings, and we're with them all the time. And so, it's one of the great joys of spending my career working with students. Wonderful.
Thank you, Tina.
Inspired.
Thank you. And it's it's easy to sort of find fault with universities, but none of us are managing the kind of diverse community, no politician in their district. Universities are still the last place in American society where people with such different narratives and such different views still come together and need to live together. So thank you all for just your thoughtfulness and advice for all of us in how to think about these issues and how we can get through this time. Now I want to turn it to the JDCA CEO, my friend Haley Soifer. And thank you to all the panelists. Really, your comments and contributions were incredible.
Thank you so much, Stacy, for moderating our discussion. Thanks to Nicholas, Tina, and Julia for joining us today. And thanks to our former fellows as well for sharing your questions, your expertise, and a special thanks to Hillel International for partnering with us in this important event as we aim to combat and fight anti-Semitism on campus. At JDCA, we continue to call on our elected officials to take any and all necessary steps to combat anti-Semitism. We are grateful to the Biden administration for leading this effort through its comprehensive national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, and we will continue to take action to support Democratic candidates and elected officials who align with our values, which include, of course, combating hate and anti-Semitism, whether it's on campus or beyond. Today's event marks our 13th community conversation since Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th. Over the past 4+ months, we have had over 8,000 RSVPs for these conversations. We have sent over 2,000 letters to Congress supporting a wide range of policy positions, and thankfully, we have seen some progress with the launch of investigations into the horrific sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas and the continued efforts of the Biden administration and others to ensure the release of the hostages. But our work is far from over, and we hope you will stay involved with us in this critical election year as we continue to advocate for our values and work to elect Democrats who share those values. You can visit our website, jewishdems.org, to learn how to stay engaged and to also make a gift to support our work and programs like these. We have 2 upcoming opportunities to join us over the next 2 weeks. The first is next Friday, March 8th at 9 a.m. You can join JDCA's Ohio chapter as well as the Ohio chapter for Jewish Women for Joe for a post-State of the Union discussion. We'll discuss the biggest takeaways from the president's speech over coffee and Zoom and hear the views of those in a battleground state like Ohio. To join the program, you can click on the link in the chat. And the next week on Wednesday, March 13th, join us at 1:30 p.m. Eastern for our candidate forum in Maryland's 6th Congressional District in the Democratic primary. To join us, we've also put the link in the chat, and of course, we'll follow up. Again, thank you all for joining today's community conversation on anti-Semitism on campus and for continuing to be a part of our movement and our organization. We're grateful for your partnership, and we hope you have a good day and that we see you soon. Thanks.